So the idea that it's extremely dangerous to rely on the plain English reading of a statute. Why is that? Well, folks, because statutes by themselves, what are they? Of course, they're laws passed by the legislature, right? Signed by the governor, or maybe pocket passed. In some states, the governor is not required to sign a law. If he lets it sit long enough, it just becomes law. Or it might be a law passed over a governor's veto. But essentially, it's the legislature branch deciding there ought to be a law about something. So they pass a statute. That statute does absolutely nothing. Not a damn thing. It's just words written on a piece of paper. Zero effect in the real world until that statute is interpreted and applied by an actual court to actual parties before the court. In our context, of course, we're typically talking about criminal cases. So that criminal statute has no impact in the real world until a judge in a criminal trial interprets and applies that statute to the parties, the state and the defense before him in that trial. That's when a statute has real world effect. Even then, it only has an effect limited to those particular parties. A trial judge's decisions about how the law applies is not binding on any other court. It's not even binding on that judge if he decides to change his mind in another court proceeding the next day with essentially similar facts. Those court interpretations of statutes are not binding on anybody until and unless they are interpreted by the appellate courts. In most states, there'd be a mid-level kind of a court of appeals between the trial court and the highest level court in the state, which is typically called the Supreme Court, but not always. New York State, for example, is weird. It calls New York State's Supreme Court, the highest court in the state, is actually called the Court of Appeals. Most states, the Court of Appeals is the mid-level courts. So you have to watch out for that kind of thing. But until it's an appellate court interpreting a law, there is no precedential value. It's not controlling on anybody else because that precedential authority flows downhill, right? If you imagine a pyramid with the state Supreme Court at the top, its decisions on how the law should be applied are controlling on every other court in the state, because the authority flows downhill from them. The mid-level appellate courts, typically their decisions are binding on the trial courts within their district, within their area, but not necessarily on other trial courts. We see this commonly in the federal level, right? Where there's federal courts of appeals. There's different ones, different areas around the country where they're assigned, the Ninth Circuit, the Fifth Circuit, and so forth. And they have a ruling, and typically their rulings, like we have a very favorable ruling out of the Fifth Circuit right now on arm braces, the ATF arm brace rule. And strictly speaking, it probably only applies within the Fifth Circuit. They did do a weird thing with that ruling where they said it applies to the Fifth Circuit only, and also to the members of one of the plaintiffs, the Firearms Policy Coalition, which is suing over this ATF rule. So a lot of people just became members of FPC, even if they don't live in the Fifth